In the shadowy world of prisons, power isn't always as it seems.
I couldn't tell my coworkers. I couldn't tell anybody.
From Richard Matt and David Sweat manipulated prison employee Joyce Mitchell into smuggling tools for their dramatic escape, to Baltimore gang leader Taon White controlled an entire detention center, impregnating 4 female officers. These cases expose critical vulnerabilities in our correctional systems and the devastating consequences when manipulation meets vulnerability. Terry Banks and Lynette Barnett. Our first case takes us back to 1999 to the Crossroads Correctional Center in Missouri. Here, inmate Terry Banks orchestrated one of the most brazen prison escapes of the decade, and he didn't do it alone. His accomplice, prison guard Lynette Barnett, a woman who had taken an oath to enforce the law, not break it. The relationship between Banks and Barnett developed gradually over months of subtle manipulation. Banks, serving time for armed robbery, had a reputation as a smooth talker among both inmates and staff. What began as seemingly innocent conversations during Barnett's shifts evolved into something far more inappropriate and dangerous. According to investigators, Banks methodically identified vulnerabilities in Barnett's personal life. She was going through a difficult divorce, feeling underappreciated at work, and struggling financially, all factors that Banks allegedly exploited to gain her trust and eventually her devotion. By the time their plan was put into action, Barnett had been completely drawn into Banks's web of manipulation. She smuggled in a fake ID and a guard's uniform for Banks, essential tools for his escape plan. On the appointed day, she helped create a diversion that allowed Banks to slip away, disguised as a fellow corrections officer. The manhunt for the escaped convict and his accomplice stretched across multiple states. For approximately 2 months, the pair managed to evade capture, reportedly traveling together through Missouri, Arkansas, and eventually into Texas. When authorities finally caught up with them in a small Texas town, Barnett showed signs of what some psychologists might describe as a form of Stockholm Syndrome. Still seemingly devoted to Banks, despite the destruction of her career and reputation, the legal consequences were severe. Barnett faced charges for aiding and abetting an escape, providing false identification, and misuse of her position. She was ultimately sentenced to 5 years in prison, transitioning in an instant from guard to inmate in the very system she had once served. Banks, recaptured and returned to prison, received additional time added to his sentence for the escape, but in many ways, he had already achieved a significant victory. He had managed to manipulate someone specifically trained to resist such manipulation, turning the power dynamic of the prison completely on its head. Perhaps one of the most infamous cases of inmate manipulation involves the story of Randolph Dial and Bobby Parker. Randolph Dial was not your typical inmate. A sculptor and artist serving life for murder, Dial had been granted special privileges at the Oklahoma State Reformatory in Granite due to his artistic talents. He worked in a prison pottery program run by Bobby Parker, the wife of the deputy warden, who lived with her husband and 2 daughters in a house on the prison grounds. In 1994, Dial made his escape from the prison, but he didn't go alone. Bobby Parker disappeared with him, leaving behind her husband and young daughters. What followed would become one of the most perplexing mysteries in prison escape history. For nearly 11 years, Dial and Parker lived together, taking on new identities as a married couple. They settled in East Texas, working on a chicken farm, living in a mobile home, and keeping to themselves. Their disappearance became a cold case, with authorities increasingly unsure whether Parker was a victim or an accomplice.
I was greeted with 3 law enforcement officers in assault gear.
The case broke wide open in April 2005 when an anonymous tip to America's Most Wanted led authorities to the chicken farm in Texas. Dial was arrested and Parker was finally separated from her alleged captor after more than a decade. What happened next added layers of complexity to an already confounding case. Randy Parker, still working for the Oklahoma Department of Corrections, drove through the night to reunite with his wife. According to both their accounts, he embraced her immediately with unconditional acceptance.
It was just a mixture of so many different emotions. You know, the fear, the anticipation, but yet being afraid to get excited, you know, about seeing her husband and family because, you know, what if they didn't want her anymore?
And finally, the moment arrived. After more than a decade, husband and wife were reunited in a hotel lobby.
I just walked up to her and put my arms around her, told her she was going to be okay now.
But the story was far from over. Dial, in interviews before his death in 2007, claimed that Parker had willingly gone with him and stayed with him voluntarily all those years. Parker, however, maintained that she was a kidnapping victim who lived in constant fear. She claimed Dial had threatened to harm her family if she ever tried to escape or reveal her true identity. The case became even more complicated when investigators discovered romantic cards and letters exchanged between Dial and Parker during their time together. This evidence, along with testimony from neighbors who who saw no signs of Parker being held against her will, cast doubt on her version of events. Despite returning to her family, Parker's ordeal wasn't over. Oklahoma prosecutors, unconvinced by her kidnapping claims, charged her with assisting a prisoner to escape. After a sensational trial that reopened all the questions about her relationship with Dial, Parker was convicted in 2011 and sentenced to 1 year in prison. She served 6 months before being released. Our next case takes us across the Atlantic to Liverpool, England, where two brothers managed to seduce the same prison guard, leading to one of the more unusual prison scandals in recent UK history. Aaron and Hayden Whitaker with Lucy Thornton. In 2019 at HMP Alt Course in Liverpool, prison officer Lucy Thornton found herself entangled in a complex and entirely inappropriate relationship with not one, but two inmates, brothers Aaron and Hayden Whitaker. What makes this case particularly notable is how the manipulation extended beyond the prison walls to affect Thornton's personal and financial life. According to court documents and reporting, the relationship began when Thornton was assigned to the wing where Aaron Whitaker was incarcerated. Investigators would later discover that Aaron methodically cultivated a relationship with Thornton, initially presenting himself as a sympathetic listener to her personal problems before gradually escalating the relationship. The manipulation took on a new dimension when Aaron's brother Hayden, also incarcerated at the same facility, became involved. The brothers allegedly coordinated their efforts, with both engaging in inappropriate relations with Thornton and gradually increasing their demands. What began as flirtation and against regulation conversations soon evolved into Thornton smuggling prohibited items into the prison. Reports indicate she brought mobile phones and other contraband for the brothers, items that have enormous value in the prison black market and can enable further criminal activity from behind bars. Perhaps most troubling was how the Whitaker brothers allegedly exploited Thornton financially. Court documents suggest they convinced her to make payments toward a drug debt they claimed to owe to other inmates, effectively using her salary to finance their criminal obligations. The extent of the manipulation became clear when authorities discovered that Thornton had become pregnant during the affair. In August 2020, she gave birth to a child allegedly fathered by Aaron Whitaker, permanently linking her to the inmate she had been professionally responsible for supervising. When the inappropriate relationships were discovered, Thornton was immediately suspended and subsequently fired from her position. Criminal charges followed, and in a Liverpool court, she pleaded guilty to misconduct in a public office, a serious charge that reflects the breach of public trust involved in her actions. The legal consequences were significant. Thornton was sentenced to 10 months in prison, transforming her from a corrections officer to an inmate. Her case was particularly sensitive, as she would potentially be incarcerated alongside women she had previously guarded, creating complex security issues for the prison system. For the Whitaker brothers, the manipulation of Thornton represented a significant victory in the prison's social hierarchy, enhancing their status among other inmates while providing them with contraband and outside financial support. They faced additional charges related to possession of prohibited items, but had already been serving their original sentences. Few cases of inmate manipulation have gained as much national media attention as the shocking relationship between Renell Wilson and Nancy Gonzalez. This case stands out not only for the heinousness of Wilson's original crimes, but also for the dramatic pregnancy that resulted from their illicit encounters. Renell Wilson was not just any inmate. He was on death row at the Metropolitan Detention Center in New York, convicted of the cold-blooded execution-style murders of two undercover NYPD detectives in Staten Island in 2003. His crime had shocked the city. The officers attempting to purchase illegal firearms from Wilson were shot point-blank in their car, with Wilson delivering fatal shots to the back of their heads after they were already wounded. Despite the notoriety of his crime and his death sentence, the first federal death sentence in New York in over 5 decades, Wilson managed to develop an inappropriate relationship with corrections officer Nancy Gonzalez. According to court documents, between 2012 and 2013, Gonzalez had sexual encounters with Wilson while she was supposed to be guarding him. In a disturbing twist to the case, Gonzalez became pregnant as a result of these encounters. Prosecutors would later reveal intercepted phone conversations where Gonzalez admitted to having sex with Wilson, suggesting she believed he deserved to have a child before his execution.
They have taped conversations, all type of stuff saying that, he deserves a baby and all this craziness.
The case became even more tragic when Gonzalez gave birth to Wilson's son in 2013, but subsequently lost custody of the child due to allegations of neglect and her continued legal troubles. Reports indicated she tested positive for cocaine after the birth, adding substance abuse issues to the complex psychological factors in the case. When the relationship was discovered, Gonzalez was immediately fired and faced criminal charges. In federal court, she pleaded guilty to sexual abuse of a person in custody, acknowledging the inherent power imbalance that legally negated any possibility of consent in her relationship with Wilson. At her sentencing hearing, Gonzalez's defense team presented evidence of her troubled past, including childhood sexual abuse and ongoing mental health struggles, arguing these factors made her vulnerable to manipulation by Wilson. They suggested Wilson had specifically targeted her, aware of her vulnerabilities and emotional instability. The judge, while acknowledging these mitigating factors, nonetheless sentenced Gonzalez to 1 year in federal prison, emphasizing the serious breach of public trust involved in her actions. The sentence reflected the complex nature of the case, recognizing both Gonzalez's vulnerability and the severity of her professional misconduct. For Wilson, the relationship with Gonzalez and the child it produced did not change his legal fate. After multiple appeals and retrials on the sentencing phase of his case, his death sentence was eventually overturned in 2016 and converted to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated in a maximum security federal facility. Our next case takes us back to the United Kingdom, where one of Britain's most notorious drug traffickers managed to seduce a veteran prison officer, leading to a scandal that rocked the British penal system. Curtis Warren and Stephanie Smith White. Curtis Warren, often nicknamed Cocky, was no ordinary inmate, once listed on the Sunday Times Rich list with an estimated fortune of £300 million accumulated through international drug trafficking. Warren was considered one of Europe's most significant organized crime figures. After years on the run, he was finally captured and sentenced to 13 years for a major cannabis smuggling operation. Due to his high profile and extensive criminal connections, Warren was held at HMP Franklin, a Category A high-security prison in Durham, England. It was there in 2018 that he encountered prison officer Stephanie Smith White, a 40-year-old guard with over a decade of experience in corrections. Despite Warren's dangerous reputation and the strict security protocols surrounding him, Smith White fell under his influence. According to court documents, over the course of approximately 6 months, they developed a sexual relationship that investigators would later describe as intimate and penetrative. The pair would meet in Warren's cell, with Smith White deliberately positioning herself to avoid being recorded by security cameras. The extent of Warren's manipulation became clear when investigators discovered that Smith White had made a revealing modification to her uniform, cutting a hole in the crotch of her prison-issued trousers to facilitate sexual encounters during her shifts. But the relationship went beyond physical intimacy. Evidence presented at trial showed that Warren had convinced Smith White to smuggle contraband into the prison, including a mobile phone he used to continue directing criminal operations from behind bars. She also passed information to him about prison operations and security protocols, potentially endangering her colleagues. The depth of Smith White's emotional entanglement with Warren was revealed when investigators discovered she had tattooed his name on her body alongside an infinity symbol. She had also kept a lock of his hair as a romantic keepsake and had repeatedly denied the relationship when initially questioned by prison authorities. The affair was finally uncovered in 2019 through intelligence gathered by prison anti-corruption officers. When Warren's cell was searched, they discovered a smuggled phone and began investigating how it had entered the high-security facility. The trail led directly to Smith White. Perhaps most damning was the discovery of over 450 letters from Smith White to Warren, stored by the inmate as potential leverage. These letters, along with extensive phone records showing hundreds of calls and text messages between the pair on smuggled phones, provided irrefutable evidence of their inappropriate relationship. In February 2020, Smith White pleaded guilty to misconduct in public office and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. The judge at Durham Crown Court described her actions as a catastrophic breach of trust, emphasizing the serious security implications of her misconduct given Warren's status and connections. For his part, Warren faced no additional charges but was placed under even more restrictive conditions. The case revealed significant security vulnerabilities in one of Britain's most secure prisons and led to enhanced vetting and monitoring of staff interactions with high-profile inmates. Our next case illustrates how even experienced prison staff with no previous disciplinary issues can fall prey to manipulation by charismatic and strategically minded inmates. Richard Matt, David Sweat, and Joyce Mitchell. The 2015 prison break from the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, captivated the nation and became the subject of books, documentaries, and even a critically acclaimed television series. At the center of this dramatic escape was prison employee Joyce Mitchell, whose manipulation by inmates Richard Matt and David Sweat resulted in one of the most infamous prison breaks in American history. Richard Matt, 49, and David Sweat, 35, were both serving lengthy sentences for murder. Matt had been convicted of torturing, killing, and dismembering his former former boss, while Sweat was serving life without parole for the murder of a sheriff's deputy. Despite their dangerous histories, both men were placed in the prison's honor block due to good behavior, giving them relatively greater freedom of movement within the maximum security facility. Joyce Mitchell, then 51, worked as a supervisor in the prison's tailor shop, where both Matt and Sweat were assigned to work. By all accounts, Mitchell had been a reliable employee for several years before, becoming entangled with the two inmates. She was married to another prison employee, Lyle Mitchell, and had adult children. According to court testimony and her own subsequent admissions, the manipulation began gradually. Richard Matt, described by many as charismatic and artistic, began giving Mitchell paintings he had created and paying her compliments. What began as flirtation slowly escalated into a sexual relationship, primarily with Matt, although the exact nature of her relationship with Sweat would later be disputed.
Mr. Matt wanted me to give my husband some pills to knock him out.
They called your husband
The glitch.
the glitch, meaning he was the glitch in the plan.
Over time, Matt and Sweat convinced Mitchell to smuggle tools into the prison, hacksaw blades, drill bits, and chisels, which they used to cut through the steel walls of their cells and access a catwalk behind the cell block. Night after night, they worked their way through the prison's infrastructure, eventually cutting into a steam pipe that led outside the prison walls. But the inmates' plan extended beyond the physical escape. They manipulated Mitchell into agreeing to be their getaway driver, convincing her to pack supplies, including camping equipment, clothing, and money. Most disturbingly, they persuaded her to obtain sleeping pills to drug her husband on the night of the escape, with the initial plan being to kill him.
I knew I was in so far that I had to just keep going along with it. So when Mr. Matt brought me the pills, they were in my drawer at work. And I took them home and I flushed them.
On June 6, 2015, Matt and Sweat made their escape through the cut steam pipe, emerging from a manhole outside the prison walls. According to the plan, Mitchell was supposed to meet them with a vehicle approximately a mile from the prison. However, in what she later described as a moment of clarity and panic, Mitchell failed to show up, instead checking herself into a hospital for anxiety and chest pains.
I was supposed to bring a shotgun.
He wanted to saw that off, right?
Yes,
Did you have a shotgun?
we do own a shotgun, but I had no intentions of ever bringing it.
Without transportation, Matt and Sweat were forced to flee on foot through the rugged forests of upstate New York, triggering a massive manhunt involving over 1,300 law enforcement officers. The search lasted for 3 weeks, cost an estimated $23 million, and kept the region in a state of high tension. The manhunt ended on June 26th, when Richard Matt was spotted by law enforcement near the town of Malone, New York. After refusing to surrender, he was shot and killed. 2 days later, David Sweat was shot and captured less than 2 miles from the Canadian border, bringing the escape drama to a close. Joyce Mitchell quickly became the focus of the investigation into how the escape had been possible. Initially, she attempted to downplay her role, but eventually pleaded guilty to promoting prison, contraband, and criminal facilitation. At her sentencing hearing, she expressed remorse, claiming that Matt had manipulated her through a combination of flirtation, fear, and emotional control. In September 2015, Mitchell was sentenced to 2 1/3 to 7 years in prison. She ultimately served approximately 4 years before being released on parole in February 2020. Her husband, despite the planned attempt on his life, initially stood by her side, though reports indicate they later separated. This case illustrates the extreme consequences that can result when prison staff succumb to inmate manipulation, not just for themselves, but for their families, the prison system, and the wider community. It also highlights how emotional and manipulation can be used to achieve concrete goals like prison escape, with manipulators discarding their targets once their usefulness has ended. The next story of John Manard and Toby Dorr demonstrates how inmate manipulation can target not just traditional corrections officers, but also volunteers and program administrators working within the prison system. John Manard and Toby Dorr. In 2004, Toby Young was a 47-year-old married woman who had never been in trouble with the law. After recovering from cancer, she decided to give back to society by founding the Safe Harbor Prison Dog Program at Lansing Correctional Facility in Kansas. The program rescued dogs scheduled for euthanasia and paired them with inmates who would train and socialize them for adoption. One of the inmates assigned to Young's program was John Manard, then 27, who was serving a life sentence for first-degree murder, aggravated robbery, and possession of a firearm in the commission of a felony. felony. Manard had been convicted of killing a man during a carjacking when he was just 17 years old. According to later accounts from both Dorr and investigators, Manard began by impressing Young with his work ethic and apparent dedication to the dog program. He was articulate, physically imposing at 6'2", and showed genuine skill with the rescue dogs. Young, going through a period of personal unhappiness in her marriage and still dealing with the emotional aftermath of her cancer battle, found herself increasingly drawn to Manard's attention and apparent understanding. Over time, their relationship evolved from professional to personal to romantic, all while remaining secretive within the prison environment. Manard, with significant time to plan and think, began suggesting the possibility of escape, allegedly convincing Young that he had been wrongfully convicted and deserved a second chance at life. On February 12, 2006, the pair executed their meticulously planned escape. Young arrived at the prison with a dog crate in her van, standard procedure for the dog program. However, this time, Manard had concealed himself inside the crate, covered by blankets and surrounded by papers to avoid detection during the cursory search of vehicles leaving the prison. Once clear of the prison, Young drove Manard to a rental cabin in rural Tennessee, approximately 400 miles away. They had prepared extensively, with Young withdrawing thousands of dollars from her personal accounts and purchasing a used pickup truck under an assumed name for their new life together. For nearly 2 weeks, they lived as a couple in the secluded cabin, with Manard sporting a new appearance, his prison buzz cut grown out slightly and dyed blonde. Young later described this period as feeling like a fantasy, removed from the reality of what they had done and the consequences they would face. The fantasy came to an abrupt end on February 24, 2006, when U.S. Marshals tracked them to the cabin. After a brief car chase reaching speeds of 100 miles per hour, they were apprehended. Young offered no resistance, while Manard reportedly told the arresting officers, "Don't hurt her, she did it for me." The legal consequences were severe, but notably different for each participant. Manard, already serving life, received an additional 10 years for the escape. Young, with no prior criminal record, pleaded guilty to aiding and abetting an escape and was sentenced to 27 months in federal prison. During her incarceration, Young's husband divorced her, and she lost contact with much of her family. She changed her name to Toby Dorr after her release, seeking a fresh start while also becoming an advocate for prison reform and speaking openly about how she was manipulated. In subsequent interviews and a memoir published years later, Dorr described how Manard had systematically identified and exploited her vulnerabilities, her unhappy marriage, her emotional state following cancer, and her desire to help others. She characterized her relationship with Manard as coercive control, though she acknowledged her own responsibility for the choices she made. What makes this case particularly notable is how it demonstrates that inmate manipulation is not limited to targeting corrections officers, but can extend to anyone working within the prison environment, including volunteers and program administrators who may lack the formal training that officers receive regarding inmate manipulation tactics. Our final case may be the most extensive and systematic example of inmate manipulation on our list, involving not just a single prison staff member, but an entire network of corrupt relationships that fundamentally compromised an entire correctional facility. Taon White impregnating officers. Taon White was no ordinary inmate. As the leader of the notorious Black Guerrilla family gang inside the Baltimore City Detention Center, White wielded extraordinary power within the facility's walls. What makes this case particularly shocking is not just one instance of seduction and manipulation, but White's ability to corrupt multiple female corrections officers simultaneously, turning the prison into what investigators would later describe as a criminal enterprise run by the inmates. Between 2009 and 2013, White reportedly seduced and established relationships with at least 4 female corrections officers at the facility. In an astonishing display of his influence, he impregnated all 4 of these officers, with some bearing his children multiple times. These relationships weren't casual encounters, but ongoing entanglements where the officers became active participants in White's criminal network. In a wiretapped phone call that would later become infamous in court proceedings, White boasted, "This is my jail. I'm dead serious. I make every final call in this jail, and nothing go past me. Everything come to me." The extent of White's operation within the detention center was staggering. Court documents revealed that the corrupt officers would smuggle contraband, including cell phones, drugs, and tobacco into the facility, which White and his gang members would then sell to other inmates at enormously inflated prices. Prosecutors estimated that this illegal operation generated more than $16,000 in monthly revenue. The relationships between White and the officers went far beyond smuggling. Some of the female officers involved tattooed his name on their bodies. Some used their personal vehicles to transport gang members and contraband. Others used their positions to help gang members avoid searches or receive preferential treatment within the facility. Perhaps most disturbingly, the officers involved were not junior employees, but included supervisors and veterans with years of experience. Some had spotless disciplinary records before falling under White's influence, demonstrating how even seasoned professionals could be vulnerable to systematic manipulation. The scandal broke wide open in April 2013 when federal authorities unsealed a sweeping indictment against 25 people, including 13 female corrections officers, Taon White, and other BGF members. The indictment detailed a criminal enterprise operating with shocking openness inside a taxpayer-funded facility meant to be secure. When confronted with the overwhelming evidence against him, White eventually pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy charges and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. His testimony helped secure convictions against numerous co-conspirators. In 2014, he was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison to be served in a facility far from Baltimore. For the officers involved, the legal consequences varied based on their level of participation, but many received multi-year prison sentences. Beyond the criminal penalties, they lost their careers, professional reputations, and in some cases, custody of their children. The Baltimore City Detention Center scandal ultimately became so notorious that state officials took the extraordinary step of closing the 159-year-old facility entirely in 2015, acknowledging that its infrastructure and culture were too compromised to be effectively reformed. Which of these stories surprised you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments and click on the cards on screen for more stories.